PATV presents Live from Prairie Lights, featuring the best authors and poets on the scene today. From up-and-coming to well-established writers from across the globe. You'll see them right here on PATV.
Tonight's guest, Joseph Dobrian, makes his living as a freelance writer, and his byline appears regularly in the Wall Street Journal and many other business publications. He lived most of his adult life in New York City, where he became known as a sports writer, business journalist, TV talk show host, stage and TV actor, and political activist. In 2009, he was the Libertarian Party's candidate for mayor of New York City. He's a fairly recent arrival in Iowa City, having moved here from Manhattan in the spring of 2010. He published his first novel, Willie WIlden, last year. We've got that here. His latest book, from which he'll be reading tonight, is a collection of his journalism and commentaries entitled Seldom Right, But Never in Doubt. Please welcome Joseph Dobrian.
Thank you all so much for showing up. I'm just delighted that I've got this nice of a crowd, and I am just tickled to death. What really tickled me to death was the fact that my publishers persuaded Dorothy Parker to write the foreword to this book. You know, I was afraid she'd be too fucking busy and vice versa. But she said that she would do it even if she had to come back from the dead. And it's maybe not the most flattering foreword I've ever read, but I think it was entertaining enough that I certainly wasn't offended by it. So I'm going to start by reading the words of Dorothy Parker that appear at the front of this book. Last night reminded me of the type of date in which I find myself imprisoned oftener and oftener these days as my birthdays approach the fatal 30 mark. An endless dinner with a man who knows everything and simply will not entertain the quaint little notion that he might occasionally be mistaken. With the exception that when I am literally being dined by such a gentleman, he will usually see to it that my dainty glass of sherry remains at least half full. In this instance, though, I had to content myself with an apple and Joseph Dobrian's new book, Seldom Right, But Never in Doubt, the very heft of which suggests that Mr. Dobrian is rather more than half full of himself. Or full of something, at any rate. Some may find his confessionals and declarations enlightening. I'm much more fascinated by the pathology. Oh dear, there I go again, being perfectly cruel to someone I'm sure is a very nice young man. Actually, I could have stomped my little slippers on the hearthrug for joy when I discovered that this journalist, novelist, and political gnat had finally gotten his pontifications, which have been published in various venues over the past 15 years, organized in book form. It's difficult to support any argument that Mr. Dobrian is a great writer, or even a very good one, but he has at any rate mastered the art of verbal ecdysiasm. That is no mean feat. However, the question of whether he has exposed anything worth seeing is left to you, dear reader. At least the question might be debated if anyone took Mr. Dobrian 1/10 as seriously as he evidently likes to pretend he's being taken. It's clear that Mr. Dobrian is one of those people who cannot go through life without seeing himself, playing himself in a high-budget movie, doing whatever he's doing at the moment. In his rare moments of idleness, no doubt, he's the sort who poses for formal portraits in his dressing room mirror. In many of his essays, Mr. Dobrian is clearly trying to be a wit. In others, he tries to shock. At times, he's a pedagogue. At other times, a mere purveyor of opinions. Occasionally, a storyteller. Always and above all, though, ostentation is his racket. One finds it difficult to escape the conclusion that Mr. Dobrian is, in most of his essays, a little less interested in stating his case than he is in impressing the reader with his style, or dare I say that it exists, his charm. But let it never be suspicioned, rumored, or otherwise bruited about that we are dealing with a stylist here. Mr. Dobrian has an adequate knowledge of the English language, as befits anyone who makes his living as a ghostwriter and trade journalist. and thus his prose is readable. It does not, however, cause one by its magnificence to leap from one's chair and do a dance a joyous tango with one's French poodle. Once or perhaps twice in reading these essays, you notice that some merciful pixie of a literary bent has whispered a memorable epigram into Mr. Dobrian's ear. All of us dream of being God. None of us would be a saint. That's one I don't think I'd heard before. And therefore I must give Mr. Dobrian the benefit of the doubt and assume that he invented it. You can just about see Mr. Dobrian tucking himself into bed with a coprophagous grin on the night that he thought of that little gem, secure in the knowledge that it would one day find a home in the pages of Bartlett's. We might also point to the occasional instance of genuine humor, as when Mr. Dobrian describes an attack of gout in A Most Romantic Illness. At other times he can be enlightening, if you happen to be interested in the somewhat esoteric subjects on which he chooses to enlighten us. I, for one, do not know how I ever got along without knowing all about the evolution of the word Nimrod as a common noun. But now, thanks to A Nimrod in Search of Daffisms, I plan to dine out on this precious knowledge, oh, ever so often. At first blush, one occasionally will get the impression that Mr. Dobrian adopts positions not because he believes them, but because he knows they will shock. But close reading of many of these essays will leave one convinced that however naughty, perverse, or just plain batty our young Sparky might be, he at least means every word he says. Whether or not his arguments are defensible, never let it be said that Mr. Dobrian ever takes the majority view without adopting a variant of it that the majority of his readers will find insufferable. In rare dramatic instances, the dear man is actually right, as in his various rants on political correctness and criminal justice. But on those occasions, he states his point in a manner clearly calculated to induce rages and massive strokes, rather than conversions, amongst those who take the opposite view. Mr. Dobrian conscientiously makes himself dislikable at times with all the fervor of one who wants no more than unequivocal adoration from everybody. Now, one of my essays that did piss off a few people was one that I wrote with regard to the famous case of the Westboro Baptist Church, which was sued for picketing at the funerals of veterans with signs saying God hates fags and so forth. This case was decided in the U.S. Supreme Court more than a year ago, but I wrote this while the case was still in the appeals process. Now, I am a libertarian, and my views are very much informed by that. And part of being a libertarian is being a free speech absolutist. And that was the point of view from which I wrote this essay, which is entitled Shouts of Fire and Fighting Words. The United States Supreme Court has agreed to rule on whether a dead soldier's family can sue protesters who picketed near their son's burial service with signs that suggested that military casualties were God's punishment of the U.S. for tolerating homosexuality. A jury in Maryland had previously awarded Albert Snyder, the father of the dead soldier, $10 million in damages in his suit against the Reverend Fred Phelps and his Westboro Baptist Church, on the grounds that by demonstrating near the burial service, the defendants had invaded the mourner's privacy and inflicted emotional distress. That judgment was thrown out last fall by a federal court of appeals on free speech grounds. Now, it transpires, a judge has ordered Snyder to pay Phelps legal bills to the tune of about $16,000 in view of the fact that the original verdict was overturned. This order has met with widespread outrage, and the number of people, most prominent among them is talk show host Bill O'Reilly, have stepped in to pay these bills on Snyder's behalf. I submit that O'Reilly et al. Are entirely within their rights to contribute financially to Snyder's cause. However, I take the position that in these circumstances, Snyder should indeed be made to pay Phelps's bills. It's clear to me that Snyder and his lawyers brought this suit not because the Snyder family suffered financial damages or emotional damages that were worth more than $1. No, I submit that they brought this suit with the objective of financially ruining Phelps and his family. In my book, that is malicious prosecution, and should not be tolerated. The suit amounted to an attempt to punish the defendant with bankruptcy for harshing the plaintiff's mellow. The plaintiff wanted to feel sad and solemn and was made to feel angry instead. That's unpleasant, but it's not actionable, in my opinion. Are Phelps et al. Horrible people? I'd say so. But can we use the justice system to bankrupt someone, that being the obvious objective here, as punishment for extreme obnoxiousness? I'd say no. Our laws protecting freedom of speech do not exist to protect speech that most people approve of. Such speech needs no protection. The laws exist rather to protect speech that we abominate, speech that would be deeply offensive to most sensible people. The laws exist, you might say, almost specifically to protect the disgusting antics of Phelps and his odious posse. Now, what did Phelps et al. Do to Snyder? They carried signs at some distance from the gravesite, apparently. Did they interfere with the service? No. Did they threaten? No. Did they physically harm or obstruct anyone? No. Columnist Michael Smerconish, writing in the Philadelphia Inquirer, stated, "The lawyer in me hopes the court restricts Westboro's free speech rights in the same way it has in the past with regard to defamation, obscenity, and so-called fighting words. It's a crime to yell fire in the theater. It should be one to yell fag at a fallen soldier's funeral as well." I suggest that that is not the lawyer in Mr. Smerconish talking. It's the emotional idiot talking. First of all, let's talk about fighting words. The law does recognize that term, does recognize that some words in some circumstances are so offensive that the person who utters them can reasonably expect a blow in response. However, fighting words is an extenuating circumstance to be used on behalf of the person who threw the punch. It is not an excuse for prosecuting the speaker of those words, either civilly or criminally. In other words, if I insult you in some unspeakable way and you punch me in the face for it, the courts will take my provocation into account when deciding whether and to what extent you should be prosecuted for hitting me. However, the courts will not, should not, must not prosecute me for uttering those words. Now let's talk about the idea that Phelps' behavior was equivalent to shouting fire in a crowded theater. I've heard that one from other commentators besides Smerconish, and it's a moronic argument wherever it comes from. First of all, strictly speaking, it's not a crime to yell fire in a theater, as Smerconish asserts. The consequences of that action, if a stampede results in injuries or property damage, for example, might be punishable. If no damage results, the worst charge that could be made to stick is disorderly conduct, which is a civil offense much like a traffic ticket. However, no sensible policeman would write that ticket, and no sensible theater manager would demand that the cop do more than throw the offender out on the street. Second, carrying signs, or yelling fag for that matter, does not constitute a potential danger to anyone but the carriers or the yellers themselves. To whom else were Phelps et al. Creating a hazard? Okay, so their conduct made people turn away in disgust, as well it might have. But I submit that the odium of their fellow man is the only punishment that can rightly be brought against them. If Snyder's suit against Phelps is allowed to go forward, it will confirm the already prevalent and horrifying notion that you can break anyone you wish to break merely by bringing a suit against him. However frivolous that suit might be, he'll still have to defend himself against it and pay astronomical legal costs. That's a particularly pernicious danger in a situation like this one, where an emotion-based argument can persuade a jury to impose outrageous damages. The calls for the reinstatement of those ridiculous damages, or even just the reinstatement of the suit, are to me far more offensive than anything Phelps and his pals might have said. Phelps can be laughed off on the grounds that he's ultimately powerless. A whole gang of imbeciles condoning the seizure of his assets, that constitutes a real danger. Now, the rest of the book, well, there's other political writing in the book as well, but much of the book has to do with subjects such as food and drink, personal style. I've got a couple of articles in there about the way I dress, which, let's face it, I get a lot of comments about in the course of every day. There's a piece or two about music, about the English language. I love taking the English language apart. And I'll read you one of the articles that I wrote about the awful English language, as I call it. And this is an article about euphemisms. How do we determine what is a socially acceptable term for various bodily parts or functions and what is not? In other words, why is it okay to talk about sleeping with someone when in fact you probably didn't sleep a wink, but other terms for the same act are considered unprintable and in some cases a basis for legal sanctions? How did vagina get to be the correct clinical term while the Middle English quaint evolved into a word that many people consider the most obscene in our lexicon? Why couldn't it have been the other way around? Oh, and I don't want anybody writing me back with sorry explanations like, because the F word and the C word are just ugly words. You're going to have to do better than that. In some cases, it's easy to see why one term is more socially acceptable than another. For instance, P is considered fairly genteel since it's an abbreviation of a naughtier word. But how did the naughty term come to be regarded as vulgar in the first place? In Elizabethan times, everybody used it. If you wanted to be excruciatingly proper, you made water. Nobody bothered to say urinate. One thing that most of the bad words have in common is that they are of Anglo-Saxon origin, whereas the proper or clinical terms usually come from Latin or Greek, or less frequently from another language. Some of the slang terms that are considered reasonably genteel are also of foreign origin. Caca has its roots in Hebrew, and poop is just the English spelling of the Dutch word for the same thing. Poppycock comes from the Dutch pappekak, which also derives from Hebrew, and it means soft dung as opposed to the dried stuff, I guess. This is similar to what went on in ancient Rome. Only the lower classes spoke Latin. The educated classes spoke Greek, although it was not the native language. Julius Caesar never said et tu Brute. He said something equivalent in Greek. Even at the point of death, he had too much dignity to speak the language of hoi polloi. What I think is hilarious is that euphemisms for animal dung often sound like food. Have you never put a cow patty on a bun? Or made a pie of horse apples? Or enjoyed a few buffalo chips with salsa? I've recently been reading the diaries of the British politician Alan Clark, who referred to a bowel movement as a Thompson. As in, I had to fly to Geneva first thing this morning, which precluded the possibility of a Thompson after breakfast. Mr. Clark also uses the yuck-inducing term grey water as a synonym for diarrhea. It's been said that the Eskimos have some dozens of words for snow, and the Bedouins have at least as many terms for camel. But we seem to have at least as many words for diarrhea as we have for all other types of feces put together. Often, dance-related metaphors are used to describe this disorder of the bowels. The green apple quick-step is perhaps the most picturesque synonymous phase. Travelers in Mexico sometimes find themselves doing the Mazatlan mazurka. Even the trots implies a dance of some sort. I've also heard someone refer to a large, solid stool expelled with unusual force as a flying axe handle, which I consider a true sockdologer in the pantheon of euphemism. Mr. Clark is the only person I know who uses a surname to describe a bodily function. But both surnames and given names are used as synonyms for the penis, the most popular being Johnson, Dick, Peter, Willie, and John Thomas. Worst of all, I've heard several fellows refer to their male members as Mr. Happy. Who wants to date a guy with a smiley button between his legs? Every family has its own special euphemisms, which in some cases get passed along to other families through marriage or close friendship. Thus, if I were to return to Earth 500 years from now, I might meet someone only remotely connected to the Dobrian family who nonetheless refers to the male genitals as credentials and who, instead of urinating, does a screecher. Even using terms that are generally accepted as the most proper and clinical can get you into trouble with some folks. An America Online member recently had her privileges suspended for using the word breast in a chat room where the subject of discussion was breast cancer. The company that pays Howard Stern's salary was fined $1.7 million by the Federal Communications Commission because Stern used the word penis in a broadcast. When I was in high school, 3 of my classmates formed a fairly good jug band and often performed in the lunchroom or at school assemblies. Their signature piece was a ribald song called Charlotte the Harlot. They once performed this song at a school assembly and were subsequently given a good talking to by the principal. He didn't mind the song's risque subject matter so much. What he objected to in the lyrics was the word vagina. It would seem to me that if everybody stopped being shocked or offended by certain words, they'd lose their attraction in a big hurry. When Big Bird says shit on Sesame Street, we will have taken a step away from the idea that mere nouns and verbs have some sort of evil mojo, whereas other words that describe the same things are somehow less powerful. The unfortunate trade-off, though, is that there then might not be any need for some of our more picturesque expressions. Somehow it's more fun to excuse yourself to shake the hand of the unemployed or to launch a Democrat. Which reminds me, it's been far too long since I've made a 2-backed beast. I generally have to content myself with whipping the lizard. And fittingly enough, we end the book with a couple of essays on death, and I'm going to read one of them to you. I have several articles in this book about religion, and the last one has to do with what happens afterwards, and it's entitled simply, After I Croak. One of my online correspondents recently disagreed with my assertion that nobody asks to be born. She informed me that we do ask to be born. Each time we die, we are reincarnated in one way or another, and we each have some voice in selecting what our reincarnations will consist of. She was quite dogmatic about it, implying that whether I liked it or not, I was going to be reincarnated as something. A lot of people believe this. Others profess to believe in some sort of afterlife, heaven, hell, purgatory, nirvana, whatever. I have no way of knowing what happens to people after they die, but I suspect that none of these is very likely. I think it's more likely that when we die, we simply end. At least that's what I'm hoping. One life is quite enough for me, and even a never-ending paradise might be a worse hell than I'd care to deal with. I was astonished at how furious I got, silently, at this woman's insistence that she knew I would be reincarnated, that it was inevitable. It was somehow more offensive than some Christian threatening me with eternal damnation for not having accepted Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. You can dismiss the threat of hell by considering the source. You hear it from bitter, angry, mean-spirited, stupid people who are painfully aware that you have a pretty nice life by comparison with theirs. But I feel personally violated when some New Ager lays invariably her, beliefs on me in that manner. New Agers, by and large, don't have the excuse of being stupid or vicious, and yet I couldn't help perceiving a strong tinge of malice behind this woman's insistence that I would be reincarnated. It was presumptuous and disrespectful, like, oh, you'll have children all right as soon as you meet the right woman, only worse. Whether we believe in reincarnation or in some sort of unearthly hereafter, it would appear that we have these beliefs because we're searching for some sort of purpose in life. Some would say that we live in order to gain enlightenment, others that we live to glorify God, still others that our purpose is to take care of our fellow creatures. In any case, to keep us going, most of us apparently need a purpose or a reward at the end of it all. be it heaven or nirvana or what you will. But what if each person's life is in fact ultimately pointless? What if you get nothing at the end? What if your existence and those of all your descendants are as insignificant as the blink of a mosquito's eye? In that case, we are on a journey to nowhere. Stuart Little looking for Margalo. And maybe, as turned out to be the case with Stuart Little, the journey in and of itself is the only point of the story. That prospect does not upset me, and I don't understand why it should upset anyone. If what comes after this is mere blankness, so what? We're not likely to notice, are we? Now, you might ask, without some system of rewards or punishments, or without the need to strive for enlightenment, what would be the point of doing anything? I can't speak for others, but I do whatever I do because at the time I figure it will make my life more pleasant if I do A rather than B. It makes a person feel good if he's kind to someone else. It makes life easier if he learns more information. He'll be more comfortable in the long run if he works harder. We never do anything solely because we should do it. We weigh the consequences of our choices. We choose what we believe to be the pleasantest or the least unpleasant alternative. In a sense, we always do what we want to do. I've decided that I'd prefer to die somewhere around age 75, with the last thing to register on my mind being the woman lying beneath me, suddenly looking over my shoulder and saying, "Raoul, put that shotgun down immediately!" If I'm sent to hell, I guess I won't have much to say about what eternity will be like. Were I permitted to design my own heaven, it might be an enormous private estate, about as big as the old Russian Empire, occupied only by me and every cat I've ever lived with, plus a few more just for fun, with a huge state-of-the-art kitchen, an endless supply of food, booze, tobacco, good music, books I want to read, and absolutely no people unless I can invite them and kick them out as I please. Many people talk of seeing all their friends and family in heaven. A few even talk about meeting and making up with old enemies. That doesn't appeal to me much. I have no interest in shaking hands with people who did me wrong. Even some people I did like, I never want to see again. I once had a friend who was particularly kind and helpful to me at a time in my life when I didn't have a lot of friends. He was someone to whom I sometimes was embarrassingly ungrateful. When, not having seen him for nearly 20 years, I heard that he was dead, I felt positively relieved. There was one less person on earth who knew what I was like at my worst. I would be mortified to meet him or several other people like him in the next world. Heaven and hell sound like similar places. Perhaps they are the same place. In hell, you're pitched into an eternal fire. In heaven, you spend eternity sitting around that fire, holding hands and singing Kumbaya. Both eventualities sound mighty unpleasant to me. But I suppose that in either case, I'd become numb after a time. I don't want to be reincarnated because I see no benefit in it. As I understand it, and I admit that my understanding is imperfect, many people who believe in reincarnation hold that the reason for going through a great many lifetimes is that by so doing, you eventually hit a perfect level of spiritual enlightenment. A level that will enable you to utterly transcend the mundane. Other folks say that reincarnation is inevitable because your body and soul are not your own. They belong to the universe and must be recycled as part thereof. As to perfect spiritual enlightenment, what would I want with it? I can't buy anything with it. It won't do tricks for me. It won't even serve me a hot cup of coffee on a cold afternoon. It might get me laid, but if I were perfectly enlightened, I wouldn't be interested in such swinish pleasures, now would I? At least not according to most people who claim to know about these things. You may have my share of spiritual enlightenment if you want it. As for recycling myself, I have no objection to the universe turning my dead body into compost. But if it puts its intrusive little hands on my psyche, I am going to kick the universe right in the nuts. Whether you're assigned to an afterlife or to a new life on Earth, doesn't it come down to the same thing? Isn't it a matter of having your past, present, and future evaluated by a gang of priggish gods who bear comparison more with junior high school principals or prison guards than with anything else? No, son, I'm afraid you're going to have to go back once again, and maybe this time you'll gain some understanding. Do we never get away from school teachers, cops, bosses, and parents? It never ends. It never ends. It never ends. Thank you.
We are listening to Joseph Dobrian, who's been reading from his book, Seldom Right, but Never in Doubt, and now he's taking questions from the audience.
Joseph.
Yes, ma'am.
I think that you need to make this into an audio book because as funny as you are on paper, like David Sedaris, hearing you say it is infinitely funnier. And I really would like it if you'd make an audio book of this.
Okay. Somebody wants to pay me for it? I'll do it.
I didn't say that.
Anyone else? Comments, dirty jokes, anything?
You're getting better, Joe.
Beg pardon?
You're getting better.
Oh, thank you. I hope so. This is an exercise that I would recommend to just about anybody who thinks that they have a book in them. Just start out by writing essays, little pieces of personal opinion. Just have a word count in mind. Restrict yourself to that length of copy and say what you want to say within that frame. Keep doing it. Keep being as to the point and as intellectually honest as you know how to be, and it'll be very good practice. John.
The choice of the right word is so important. You use a different word, it has different connotations and can change the meaning in very subtle ways. How do you go about choosing just the right word?
That's a real good question, and the answer is you start by having a really big vocabulary. The more words you've got up here, the more you've got to choose from, and the better you know all the different shades of meaning, the more likely you will be to choose exactly the right word. Sometimes, though, even the best writers will make mistakes, and I'll look back at something that's already been published, and I'll say, oh, darn, there's a better word that I could have used there. Another way of developing a talent for finding the right word is to write formal poetry, poetry that has a certain strict scansion or rhyming pattern, because then you have got to use a word that fits that pattern. And by being so strict with yourself, you will learn a lot of new words, and you will discover different shades of meaning, and you will write better prose as well as better poetry.
You've mentioned a few times about restrictions in the artistic process for developing greater insight and more words. Is there a similar process for your process of research, or finding new topics, or what finding things to branch out of?
With regard to research, that's a very good question. A lot of people, if they are working on a certain subject, will get sidetracked by all the research materials that are available on so many other different subjects, and they will dart off on other tangents which might be interesting, but they are not in fulfillment of the assignment. That's another way that I developed my talents, by the way, was such as they might be, by doing commercial writing, by writing to the task, writing on assignment. If somebody asks me to write an article about conduit lenders, then I will go and research the topic of conduit lending. And if I get sidetracked by an article on the placement of equity, then I'm going to discount that. Whereas if I were just writing for my own personal amusement, I might dart off on that tangent and come up with an article that didn't really amount to much. And in that case, my editor would be very displeased with me, and I would never work for them again, and I would end up washing dishes or something, which I have done, and I didn't enjoy it very much.
Joseph, you're able to talk about a lot of subjects that we would all consider to be taboo, embarrassing, or even offensive in a very frank, open, confident manner. Is that something you've had your entire life, or did you develop that over time?
Well, it's like that John Mayer song, "No Filter in My Head." There's that song by John Mayer called "My Stupid Mouth," and it describes a date that he had where all of a sudden he said the wrong thing, and he didn't realize at the moment that it was the wrong thing, but 1 second later he could tell that his date was offended and that he had blown the scene entirely and was never going to see her again. That happens to me a heck of a lot. And I suppose it could be that I talk about sex and bodily functions and things like that fairly frankly because there's no filter in my head, or it could mean that I simply have a really filthy mind.
More questions?
Mildred.
Say about your early life. This is not to do with the writing. Your early life that you started in Iowa City and went to City High with my daughter.
That's right. I did go to City High with your daughter, and that's right. That's right. I remember her as well.
And with my daughter, too.
Yes, yes, indeed.
When did you leave?
Oh, there's all kinds of people in this town who can blackmail me with all kinds of stuff.
When did you leave Iowa City for New York?
1983.
That way.
But yeah, I remember your daughter very well. I had a little bit of a crush on her. I don't think she reciprocated. Anyone else? Yes.
In addition to John Mayer, are there other writers that you look to for inspiration?
Well, if you're talking about writers who are also known for their songwriting, I would have to mention Joni Mitchell. She's probably my favorite poet/songwriter of all time. As for writers of prose, George Orwell would have to be at the top of the heap. Mark Twain is up there. A.J. Liebling, who is not too well known anymore, but he used to write for The New Yorker. He wrote a lot about sports. Dorothy Parker, of course, is a dear old friend of mine, and she was kind enough to write the foreword, so I guess she must feel the same way about me. And for fiction, I would say my favorite writer of fiction, I have to use my Howard Cosell voice here, William Makepeace Thackeray.
More questions for Joseph Dobrian?
Yes, John.
Tell us more about Dorothy Parker.
Dorothy Parker was a great composer of light verse, for one thing. One of my favorites of hers was a quatrain. I like to drink a martini, 2 at the very most. With 3, I'm under the table. With 4, I'm under my host. No, seriously, Dorothy Parker was a very admirable writer, somebody worth getting to know, because She was so screwed up. She had all kinds of neuroses. She suffered severely from alcoholism. And yet she was so self-aware. She knew exactly what was wrong with her, and she was able to speak about it quite eloquently. And she wrote a short story that is very near to my heart called Big Blonde. It's a short story about a middle-aged alcoholic woman, and it was so believable because the author knew her character so intimately. Anybody else? Yes.
How often do you write? Do you write every day? Do you have a certain kind of schedule?
No, I don't have a schedule because my writing depends on, first of all, what I'm being paid for. My paying projects always take priority. And sometimes I've got more paying work going on and sometimes less. And these essays in this book, most of them have been published elsewhere, but they weren't the sort of thing that paid me a lot of money. So I would regard them as more recreational writing than anything else. So if I have a lot of time to do recreational writing, I'm usually not happy about it because it means that I'm not getting enough paying work. And if I'm getting plenty of paying work, well, you know what? I would rather be financially secure than be a great artist. Got to be honest about that. However, it looks like November and December are going to be a slow period, and November is National Novel Writing Month, when a bunch of us get together and commit to cranking out at least 50,000 words in that month. Now, I have got about 70,000 words so far on my next novel, and I'm hoping that I can crank out another 50 in November and another 50 in December. I will then have a first draft about the size of the Caine Mutiny. And then I will give myself a year and a half to rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it. And with any good luck, in the fall of 2014, I will be right back here with that book. And
More questions for Joseph Dobrian?
I guess then we can wrap up.
Let's
Thank you
thank
all
him.
so much.
And he'll be happy to sign copies of his books for you. Thank you.
I just had to say hi.